Hey guys, it's Dr. Hayes, and this is the video about animal tales, animal stories. We have a lot to talk about in this video. You had three different pretty big name authors that you had to read for this video. We're talking about Kenneth Grahame, Beatrix Potter, and A.A. Milne. And so we've got lots to talk about, lots to tell you and show you. So we're going to get right into it. But what we're talking about in general is the genre of animal fantasy, is what it's usually called, animal fantasy. And this seems so natural and normal to us now because a lot of children's books have animals as characters. And, this is pretty normal. We have Berenstain Bears and the Richard Scarry books, pick up any children's book off of a shelf and you are likely to find one where all the characters are animals and they wear clothes and they act like animals do. Peppa Pig is another one, that whole franchise. And so we're talking about animal fantasy is a genre of children's books where all of the characters live in almost like a human world with homes and maybe cars, and they wear clothes and things like that. They live in a humanized world, and they're anthropomorphized, meaning they are given human characteristics and human appearances. Some of their appearance is humanized a little bit, but they're still animals. And that where we have, Looney Tunes is like that. All the Mickey Mouse and all that whole world, in Disney, that's like that. Where you have animals that live in the world, in a human world with human things, except they're animals. That's so natural to us now, but that really wasn't in existence before Kenneth Grahame and Beatrix Potter together are kind of credited with starting the animal fantasy genre in the very beginning of the 1900s. Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit stuff started coming out a couple of years before Kenneth Grahame in 1908 published The Wind in the Willows. But together, they were like sort of the early beginnings. Now, if you recall, in Alice in Wonderland in 1865, there were anthropomorphized animals. You had the rabbit and the caterpillar, and you had the mock turtle, and all of these. You had some animals that had some anthropomorphized characteristics, but the protagonist of that book, the main character, was still a human girl, and there were still humans throughout the text as major characters, but there were just some fantasy characters that were animals that wore clothes and could talk. And because the whole thing is supposed to have happened as a dream inside of Alice's mind, then you can kind of write that off as that's why the animals had human characteristics, because they were in a dream. But it's not like the whole thing, like the premise of it was set in a humanistic world except everybody's an animal. Right? So you might put Alice out there as an example. We also have some examples in folk tales like Three Little Pigs and, some of the older folk tales where there are, animals are the main characters. We are going to read some of the folk tales of, like the Uncle Remus stories from the American South, Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, things like that. Aesop's fables, a lot of those are about animals and they talk and have thoughts and things. Some people put the Jungle Book forward as a possible animal fantasy. It was a little bit before Kenneth Grahame and Beatrix Potter, but the animals in it, they're in the jungle. It's very much still an animal world. The main character is still a human, Mowgli. And though the animals talk and have thoughts and personalities, they don't wear clothes and they don't live in houses and stuff. So it's still not quite exactly the animal fantasy that we're the genre that we're talking about. So Kenneth Grahame and Beatrix Potter are credited with sort of founding that genre, and then Winnie the Pooh, A. Milne with Winnie the Pooh came right after that. However, again, the main character in Winnie the Pooh, if you count Christopher Robin as the main character, he's a human, and so it's not even exactly quite in the same realm as animal fantasy, because it's a little boy whose toys come to life, and it's all in his imagination. So yeah, but we're mainly focusing on Beatrix Potter and Kenneth Graham for that genre, but then we're also looking at Winnie the Pooh, because it goes right along with those and came out similarly around the same time. So there's a lot to go over. You had a lot to look at for this class. However, most of your reading was in Kenneth Graham, the first few chapters of Wind in the Willows, and then the Winnie the Pooh is just one little story, and then Beatrix Potter is just a couple. Those take just a few minutes to read. So the majority of your reading is in Kenneth Graham. So we're going to talk about Kenneth Graham first. If you look in the files section of Canvas, there's a folder called Background Notes and Handouts, I think is what it's called. And there are some handouts from a lot of these Golden Age authors and a couple others we're going to read this semester. There's some background notes from when I was in grad school, and I studied these a lot. So these are just extra. I didn't assign you to read them. If we were meeting in person, I would have had printouts to give you, and we would talk about them in person. But for now, I'm going to pull them up, and we can look at them on the screen for a little bit. Oh, whoops. But yeah, for the most part, if you just want to pull them up and look through them, I'm going to point a few things out from the handouts as we go. I'm going to minimize myself here so we can say this is Kenneth Graham. I don't know why Ioan Gruffudd is right there. We're going to cover him up because he's not Kenneth Graham. So this is Kenneth Graham. So I wanted to talk a little bit about him and the sort of background of who he was and how he was writing. How he came to write The Wind in the Willows. So he had a pretty dark childhood. His mother died when he was 5. He had siblings. His dad was an alcoholic and gave up the kids to an uncle or an aunt or something, a family member. And so he had to move. He's from Scotland. That's where he was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. And so that's where he grew up, but he ended up spending a lot of time in England instead, and because of when he was handed off from family members. And he went to Cambridge, I believe, and he was a mathematics major, and he ended up working for the Bank of England. The major bank that's in England, the Bank of England. He worked his way up the ranks, and he was a senior member. He was the secretary of the Bank of England, which is kind of a pretty prestigious position. But when he retired, and so he maintained that career throughout his lifetime, even though he wrote and things on the side. He also was a banker. Very kind of ho-hum career for someone who writes animal fantasy novels and things. He ended up settling in the Lake District in England. We'll hear about the Lake District again when we talk about Beatrix Potter. And a lot of poets lived in the Lake District. If you studied British literature, Wordsworth and Coleridge lived in the Lake District, and later on several poets and authors would make their way there to have the country and have a retreat and sort of use the solace of nature. And so Kenneth Graham does have fond memories of going on vacations and holidays near the River Thames, which is the big river that runs through England and through London. Specifically, if you see the big river with the Ferris wheel in London, that's the River Thames, and it runs throughout the countryside. So probably the river and the riverbank in Wind in the Willows is based on that, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. This little boy in some of these pictures is Kenneth Graham's son. So just like Kenneth Graham himself had kind of a sad childhood, a lot of tragedy, his son did as well. His son was born blind in one eye. He was physically disabled because he had vision impairment, and he also has some kind of mental impairment as well, but scholars aren't 100% sure what it was. They were kind of private about that, but he was both physically and mentally disabled, and so Graham himself was kind of just fraught about how to take care of him, how to nurture him, how to give him what he needs. And so one of the ways that he tried to connect with his son and relate to him and entertain him was by writing him stories. So he wrote little stories, about all of these animals who live by the lake and in the woods and all the adventures they get up to. And, there's funny stuff. You didn't read all of the funny humor stuff. I didn't have you read the Toad stories. Toad is a character that you encountered, but he has a whole story arc that you didn't read in your excerpt, and those were more of the comic parts. But he wrote all these stories, and especially when his wife and son were in the countryside, and Graham would be in the city for work, he'd be away from his family for extended periods of time, so he would write letters back home to Alistair, I guess is how you say that, Alistair, and try to entertain him. And so that's where Wind in the Willows came from, was out of those stories. And this is a trend we see over and over in children's lit, whereas, we've talked about this week also with Alice in Wonderland. Charles Dodson wrote Alice in Wonderland as sort of a way to entertain a child in his life. Beatrix Potter, we'll talk about in a minute, she wrote her Peter Rabbit stories and her other stories as a way to entertain some children in her life. A.A. Milne was similarly sort of motivated whenever he was writing the Winnie the Pooh stories. So this kind of comes up over and over where you have children's lit authors who weren't intending to be such. They were just messing around and making up little characters and little stories, and they probably had either children of their own or nieces or nephews, and they were trying to entertain them and be silly, and somebody ended up saying, these are really good, you should see about publishing these. And so that happens quite a bit in the Golden Age, when writing for children was sort of just exploding, and it wasn't something that people ever set out to do on purpose. Like, that was never a career that someone would do on purpose, was I'm going to write books for children, right? Like, that wasn't a career. Usually the people who wrote for children had a day job. Charles Dodson was a mathematician. A.A. Milne was a playwright. Beatrix Potter was a conservationist and scientist. So, and Kenneth Graham was a banker. So J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, he was a playwright for adults as well. So they're usually, in this era, the authors had a day job, and they would write for children on accident, usually. So now we've seen Kenneth Graham. Let me pull up the handout. Wind in the Willows. Okay. I'm going to turn on navigation. We'll see if it'll move this to the side. Hold on. It says not responding. There we go. It'll move it to the side so I'm not blocking. Excuse me. So this handout is in Canvas, and it goes through and gives you all the background about Kenneth Graham and about Alistair and about how he wrote for him and all the other stuff about Wind in the Willows. So there's a few things I wanted to point out. The Wind in the Willows is not the first thing he wrote. Notice Wind in the Willows was 1908, but he had published a few things before that. These were all for adults, and they were collections of essays and short stories. And some of them were about children, but the audience was an adult audience. The intended audience was an adult audience. And he had very sort of high critical acclaim for these collections, specifically the Golden Age. It was very well received, but all of these were well received. And so, when he's like, I want to write something for children, his publishers were like, more of this stuff, please. Right, more of these things, please. We like these. We don't know about the whole writing for children thing. So, they were kind of iffy on that. And something that you can keep in the back of your mind while we're talking about Wind in the Willows is a lot of people, children's lit scholars included, debate whether Wind in the Willows even counts as a children's story. None of the characters are children. They act childlike. Like Toad is very childlike. Mole is definitely starts the story very childlike. So there's a lot of childlike shenanigans and personalities and sort of naivete, and sort of the carefree lifestyle and the boating and things like that. Those are things that children would enjoy. And they're cute animal characters, so that's something children would enjoy. But so the conflicts that the characters have to overcome, the fact that they are adult men in the story. They're animals, yes, but they are adult men. That plays a factor. They're not actually children. And the vocabulary is very elevated. The level at which the text is written is a pretty high level. So that's something you can kind of keep in your mind is this even for children at all? And not everybody agrees, and it's fine if you don't. Let me see. Let me find the cursor. Here we go. So I'm not going to read this whole handout to you. You can read through it if you want. I did want to talk about a little bit about this historical context. Again, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but Queen Victoria died in 1901. So while the golden age of children's literature got started in the Victorian era, and with, Alice was in the Victorian era and several other things, Wind in the Willows and Beatrix Potter's Tales and Winnie the Pooh, they were published in the 20th century, the 1900s. And so Wind in the Willows is published in the Edwardian era, which is the era right after the Victorian era. It's the era leading up to World War I. It is the era that Downton Abbey is set in, if you're familiar with that. The Titanic sank in 1912, and this was 1908, so that gives you a little bit of context for about what time it is. So that's kind of the timeline that we're looking at. There was a lot of upheaval in the world. We were on our way pretty quickly toward World War I. At this point, there were... England itself was kind of in flux after Victoria died, and the empire was falling apart. And so there's a lot of political upheaval. There was a lot of social class questioning of the ways things have always been done. There were child labor issues and all these different upheavals in the world. But one thing I wanted you to notice is right here, there doesn't seem to be any of that in Wind in the Willows. Wind in the Willows is pretty conflict-free. There's not really a hint in it that anything scary or any conflict was happening. Anything. It's almost timeless in that way because of the sort of pastoral countryside rural setting and the sort of low stakes conflicts that are in the story. That's what a lot of people think makes it childlike, and is very pointedly not commenting on the current state of things at the time in Britain. So you could argue that Beatrix Potter does the same things in her tales as well. And also Winnie the Pooh. It's almost like I put them together in one class on purpose because they were all doing very similar things in their texts. So let's scroll past. I already talked about these personal influences things and the audience. Who is this? Who is it for? So I'm not going to read that to you. Animal fantasy. Well, I talked about that already. The genre. Let's talk about this genre though. Domestic fiction. Domestic fiction and adventure story. We're going to talk about those terms again when we talk about the American half of the Golden Age. When we talk about, domestic fiction is represented by Little Women on our syllabus. The adventure story is represented by Tom Sawyer on our syllabus. And so in America, it divided a little bit more clearly into girls book versus boy book. And so we'll talk about that in a different video. But more generally, you have domestic fiction and adventure story, and Wind in the Willows has both, because the part you read is mostly domestic fiction, where the action of the story is taking place in the home. It's all about the food that they eat, and the sitting around the fire, and the friendships that they make. And I mean, there's a little bit of like going out on the boat and tipping the boat and things like that, but it's mostly set around the home, and the narrative plot and the conflicts are in a home-like setting. The adventure story, the part you didn't read in Wind of the Willows, is Toad's story, where he goes on a big grand adventure away from home into the wide world that is called in the story, and has to overcome a lot of obstacles. It's very much a hero's journey. If you have studied literature and you are familiar with the concept of the hero's journey, another way to put it, and this is very common in children's lit, is the motif of home, away, home. That takes place in both halves of this book, where they start at home, they leave home for some reason, and then they come back home changed. So the more adventuring part is in Toad's story, but this book has both of those, and both are common in children's literature. But I'm not going to read all of that. We talked about the setting is the Thames, and I did want to talk about the river and all of that. Some of the characters live at the river, some of them live in the woods, and then there is the wide world. Mole starts the novel in a hole, which is his home, and he leaves to go out into the world. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I wanted you to note, I think I have, yes, here we go. The river right here, the river that's in the story it's a romanticized river. It's not really representative of any real place in England. The Thames River that I mentioned that Graham was really nostalgic for, it was not idyllic. It was polluted already at this point. Still to this day, it's very polluted. It's dirty. It's not that idealized place that it is in Wind in the Willows. And so the river that we're encountering in Wind in the Willows is a little bit more, it's romanticized. There's some looking backwards with nostalgia and rose-colored glasses to sort of make it this idealized place. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. I'm going to scoot past. Okay, so we have the characters. The main characters are all men. There are almost no women in the story. There are no women in the sections that you read, but in the part that has Toad's story, he goes and he meets a washerwoman at one point on a like a riverboat kind of a thing, and he ends up in jail, and then the jailer's daughter helps him escape. So there's a couple women who play key roles later in the book, but for the most part, our characters, their existence is they are a bunch of old bachelors. They're a bunch of gentlemen, country gentlemen, and the assumption, if they really existed in the British society where they had estates out in the country, they would have a staff. They would have a cook. They would have a maid who cleaned up. There would be women who helped run their place. So the assumption is that these characters, especially Badger, who is he's like the equivalent of like a country mayor. He's like a squire is what they call it in England, but he was in charge. He was like upper middle class. He was in charge of quite a big swath of like a rural politician is what he was. Mole and Rat, and Otter, they are all sort of these middle class men. Badger is more like upper middle class. Toad represents the aristocracy. He has a mansion. He has expendable income. So a lot of people like to read this story as a representative of like a microcosm of British society with the different classes. So it's a fantasy in that way. It's a class fantasy because in reality, these men on these different levels of society would not be friends. Like, they would not be interacting with each other. Toad would not go hang out with people like Mole and Rat and even Badger. Badger would probably not be friends with Mole and Rat, but he would be like in charge. Like, he would be like it would be like if you were friends with your mayor of your town, is how it would be if with Mole and Rat being friends with Badger. I'm sure mayors have friends, but it's not just a given that that everyone in their, in their sort of jurisdiction is friends with them. And then being friends with Toad, we don't really have anything like that in the United States. We don't have aristocracy, but it'd be like, being friends with, like, the president's kid or something. Like, he didn't really have any authority or a title or anything, or he wasn't in charge of anything, but he was extremely wealthy. Or maybe if you had like a famous celebrity who was very, very wealthy, and you were who you are, and you guys were friends. That's what it would be like with them being friends with Toad. So none of them would actually be friends. Something else I wanted to point out is all of these animals are not like, they're pests. They're kind of like off-putting choices for an animal, children's animal fantasy. They're rodents, like moles and rats and toads. It's just really funny. But the way they are characterized is very sort of endearing and innocent. So I wanted to, let me find my cursor. It's really hard. It's hidden behind this window. Okay. Country gentlemen, here we go. They don't have to work. Rat writes poetry. They mess around in boats. They have whatever food they could want. They can pack a big picnic. That's a huge thrill in the story, is having a huge picnic and a boat ride. And Badger can welcome anyone into his home, and he has people who come to him who are beneath him, and they come, people who represent the lower classes. Like, there's little mice who come see him and stuff. So they have this sort of expendable wealth and leisure time. They're basically country gentlemen of means, middle and upper middle class. Let me see. So let's talk about how the novel's put together. I'm going to scroll past a lot of this because we don't need it, but I'm going to get to this part right here. So the structure of the book is very intentional and complex, much more than people maybe notice. It has 12 chapters, and it is set up as a mock epic. So the epic structure with the 12 chapters and the way that they progress very much intentionally mirrors the Odyssey, with Odysseus or Ulysses, depending on which, if it's Greek or whatever, which version you read. See, you notice right here. And then the last chapter is even called The Return of Ulysses, where Toad has been off on his adventures, and Stoats and Weasels have taken over his palace, and he has to fight them away, much like when Ulysses returns home from his journey to the underworld, and suitors have taken over his palace, and he has to fight them off. But you just read these first few chapters here, which the first bit covers Mole's story. So we're going to focus on Mole's story, and that's the one I want you to focus on, because Toad is just sort of a secondary character. But if you liked the little part you read, it's a little bit antiquated, I guess. I love Wind in the Willows. I think it's so just sort of idyllic and adorable, and I have nostalgia for it because I grew up with it. But if you liked it and you thought it was cute, I would definitely recommend getting and reading the rest. I think you read maybe the first 4 or maybe 5. I forget what I have you read, the first 4 or 5 chapters, but the first 5 chapters kind of complete Mole's story. But I would recommend reading the rest if you have time or want to. Yeah, so Mole's story, for the most part, is wrapped up in chapters 1 through 5, but he also is in chapters 7 and 9, which are kind of one-off stories. So let's talk about Mole's story here for just a little bit. Mole goes through a journey that represents the journey that a child would go through, right? He starts at home, and he gets this sort of yearning. It's an unexplainable urge he has while he's cleaning and painting and whatever at his house, in his hole. he gets this unexplainable urge to leave and emerge out of his hole and see the world, right? And to go off and meet new people. Some people relate this, as I point out right here, some people relate this as like a child leaving the home for the first time and going to boarding school. Where they, which was a very common British tradition for young men to leave home and go to boarding school. And he meets friends, he makes mistakes, he's very naive, he doesn't understand how things work, he doesn't know where anything is. He has to be sort of initiated into the wide world and taught things. And so that's Rat's job, right? He looks up to Rat, and he tries to impress him, and, and Rat kind of looks on him endearingly as sort of this, almost like a kid brother who needs to be sort of shown the ropes and been taken care of and shown the world. But by the end of his story arc, Mole is, like, he makes mistakes, he does what he's not supposed to do, he goes off into the wildwood at night, and he gets in trouble, and he gets lost, and Rat has to go find him. So he disobeys, and he tests his boundaries, just like young people will do, and has to be rescued, and has to learn his lesson, and be humble and contrite, and promise never to do that again. But by the end of his arc, he is considered to be an equal. He's considered to be an adult. He's given a weapon. He helps plan Toad's rescue. So he is an equal member of the group by the time his story arc finishes. And in one of his final chapters, he goes back, he passes by his house where he used to live, his hole, and he sees it. And he's like, I don't really belong there anymore. He kind of has this realization that he has grown out of his old home. So I like to relate that scene in one of his last chapters. I'm pretty sure I had you get to that part, but if not, this is what happens. One of his last chapters, he has this sort of thought where he doesn't belong at his old home anymore. He's found his place out in the world. Essentially, he lives with Rat. There's no, he and Rat decide to move in together, which we'll talk about that in a minute. But I like to equate that scene with kind of like the feeling which you guys maybe have experienced already, to where you leave and go off to college. Because in America, we don't really have boarding school as a common tradition. When we leave home for the first time, we're going off to college, or moving out on our own after high school. But like when you came to college, you kind of were drawn away from home for the first time, and then you go back, and it's not quite the same. Like your room, you feel like you're a guest when you go and stay in your room, especially if you move away from home. Some of you who are commuting and live at home already, still live at home, this doesn't really apply as much. But if you move into the dorm, or if you move into an apartment, if you go to school away from where you're from, when you go back, like fall break or Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever, when you go back that first time, you're used to having all this freedom, and you've met all of these new people and had all these new experiences since the last time you were home. And so you just kind of have this feeling that you've outgrown it, that you don't really belong there anymore. The person you were when you lived there is not the person you've become in such a short time being away. And so that's kind of the experience that Mole has when he is coming back home. And he sees his home and realizes it's not his home anymore. So let's talk about Mole and Rat while we're talking about Wind in the Willows. We don't need to talk about Toad's story. I just want to make sure there's nothing else in here. Yeah. So let me talk about, let me come back up here. So let me talk about Mole and Rat off the handout real quick. So another way that I have read a couple of articles of people who have read Mole and Rat as kind of like a romance, like they ship them. To use the parlance of the pop culture age, they ship Mole and Rat as they read them as if they are a couple, or if they're dating or whatever. A really well-known and respected children's literature scholar named Kenneth Kidd. He used to be the president of the Children's Literature Association. He's published lots of well-respected scholarship in children's literature. He referred to the relationship between Mole and Rat and all of the men in Wind in the Willows as homosocial. Not homosexual. There's no sexual activity. There's no hanky-panky depicted between the characters, the men, the gentlemen in this novel. But there's homosocial. They cohabitate together. Same-sex habitation. So eventually initially Mole leaves his house and he meets Rat, and they sort of strike up together, and Mole moves in with Rat. They move in together. They live together, and throughout the whole rest of the novel, they live together. Mole leaves his home and moves in with Rat. And there's a whole part where they basically, they go, they pack a picnic and make a big special deal of it. They go out on the boat. Rat is trying to teach Mole how to do the boat. Mole doesn't really know how to do it. And there's like this sort of slapstick, funny, cute stuff where Mole ends up dumping them out of the boat and Rat laughs at him. Rat writes poetry while they're laying around. It's very much this, like, they're on a date. They're having a picnic. They're having a boat ride. They're laughing at each other, teasing, reciting poetry. I mean, if that's not a big old gay date, I don't know what it is, right? So, and Kenneth Kidd himself is gay as well, the scholar. So he was kind of noticing and recognizing that element in the text. And so, I mean, now that I go back and look at it that way, it's hard for me to unread it that way. So sorry if I've done that to you, where I've sort of permanently skewed how you can read that story. But yeah, I see it now. There's a little bit of homosocial going on in there, and Peter Hunt, who's another children's lit historian and scholar, he wrote a kind of one of the definitive biographies of Kenneth Grahame, and he talks about how when Graham's wife and his son Alistair were staying in the countryside in the Lake District for Alistair's health and everything, and I mentioned that Grahame lived in the city because he worked at the Bank of England. He had an apartment in the city and he shared it with another man. He had a male roommate in the city. So who knows? Maybe there was some interesting relationship between them, and maybe some of that was coming out in the depictions of the animals in Wind in the Willows. Who knows? One more Wind in the Willows thing I'm going to show. Let me get rid of me. And so I'm going to the internet, to YouTube. Let me see if it'll pull up. Okay, so in the 70s or maybe 80s, I don't remember exactly when it was, but there was a TV show, it was a TV show, a Wind in the Willows TV show. And, it's not responding. And it was claymation, like stop motion animation. I don't know if it was claymation, but it was stop motion animation. And it was my jam. I watched this show so much. So I have some clips. I wanted to play you from the show so that you can kind of see. I'm not going to expand it all the way because I don't know that it'll... It kind of freezes up in the screen recording when you do that. But I'm going to play a clip I'm going to play like the opening credits. And it shows you all the characters and you can kind of see. But I used to love this show. But you can kind of see little cute Mole and Rat. Let me see if it'll play. There's Mole. It's so 70s. So he grabs his coat, puts his apron on. See, he's coming out of his hole into the wide world. He's so cute. There's Rat in his boat.
Days long ago, where people are memories and stories unfold. Willows, the tales you have told me.
with this music and the scenery and the little clothes. It's very romantic. It's kind of romantic the way they're depicted in this way. There's Toad. His little motor car. I don't know that we got to that part in what you read. I don't know if we read the part with the motor car. I think maybe you did. There's Badger. He's sitting there. There are all these gentlemen. One's painting. One's, they're in the boat. And then Toad comes in and wrecks it. Badger looks like a little old man. Oh man. So anyway, yeah, that was my jam. There's one other little thing I'm gonna play. I'm gonna play this one. This is when they're in the caravan. If I can get this one to play. Go. So in the book it describes they get like a yellow caravan, like a horse and buggy kind of situation. And they're out on the road. I'm trying to get it to switch over. Oh, here it is. It's just kind of lagging. I was going to show you just a little bit. It's like a minute. Come on now. You can do it.
Writing's
Oh, it's an
not
ad.
that easy.
That's why.
Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct, but
This is the yellow. I was just so enchanted by this as a kid. The little caravan, the open road. That's Rat and Toad, and then Mole. Look at his little shirt. His Mole's little shirt won't hardly button.
It's a life all these on the open road.
Seems like his buttons are busted.
Please, on the open road.
Here today and there tomorrow. Wave goodbye to care and sorrow. You can beg or steal or borrow on the open road.
Notice Toad is rich and he stole an apple. There's some commentary there.
You are free to roam on the open road. Though you're far from home on the open road.
Never mind the wind or weather.
Cute little couple.
lanes together through the hills and trees and heather on the open road.
Okay, maybe I can. I'm trying to stop it. It won't let me stop it. Maybe if I just close it. There we go. Okay. So that was Wind in the Willows and Kenneth Grahame, probably more than you ever wanted to know. But we do need to talk about Beatrix Potter and A.A. Milne also. So I don't have as much, I don't have any videos or anything to show for them, but I do want to talk about them a little bit. So we're going to talk about Beatrix Potter next. So I have some pictures. Let me pull those up. Let me get rid of me real quick. That's A. Milne. So this is Beatrix Potter. this is what she looked like, and these are, you know, some of her illustrations. She's most known for Peter Rabbit. Let's see. We can keep it on that for just a minute. I'll turn my camera back on. So, Beatrix Potter is a complete boss. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how absolute boss Beatrix Potter is. She's like one of the coolest ladies that we will study in this class. You gotta know about Beatrix Potter. So, I have a handout about her as well that I might pull up a few things to show you, but it's in Canvas in the file section if you want to look at it. But, so just a little bit about Beatrix Potter. She grew up, her parents, like, she was born in London. Her parents were very well off and in the upper class, but they weren't there by their birth. Like, her parents were like merchants. I think that they made their fortune in like textiles and fabrics and things, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is, they were nouveau riche, like they were the new rich. Like, they had made money through industry and not through family inheritance. So there was just sort of an exclusionary aspect in British culture if you made your money through, work rather than title and inheritance. And so she was a couple generations down from when, her family got money. So so it wasn't like reckless, but there was enough that where they didn't really belong to either world. Like the titled, family aristocracy, they weren't high enough for that, but they were definitely more well off and higher class than like the working class people. So she was kind of in this middle area. Plus, her family religiously were Unitarians, which was kind of a nonconformist. They weren't Protestant Church of England. They weren't Catholic. They were Unitarian, which is another denomination, which kind of set them apart in British religious society. And so they didn't really have a home in the mainstream as far as that goes either. And so her life was very, very sheltered. I can't emphasize enough how sheltered she was. So we've seen her, so let me back up. Okay, so her parents were very, very strict. She had a brother, but they were, both of them were pretty sheltered, but she more so because she was a girl, and her parents thought that's the proper thing to do for a young Victorian girl, to be sort of sheltered. She stayed at home. She had a couple of different governesses, I think 3 or 4 actually, different governesses who educated her throughout her life. So she received a good education. And her parents were really artistic, and they liked literature, and they really valued the arts and education, but they wanted to keep Beatrix at home and protect her from society. And so the best thing I can compare it to, she had, like all Victorian middle class kids, she had a nursery that they go, and so you lived in the nursery and you spent your days in the nursery. It's like a playroom, not like a baby nursery, like a playroom. And so when you got to a certain age, you sort of grew up out of the nursery and you joined the household as like an older daughter of the household and learned the ways of the household before you moved on and were married off into your own house. A good thing to compare it to is Peter Pan, where the story of Peter Pan takes place the night before Wendy is supposed to move out of the nursery. Wendy is getting too old, right? And her father says, "That's it. You're too old for the nursery. You're moving out of the nursery," and she's devastated, right? She doesn't want to move out of the nursery. Well, that's about that's pretty accurate as far as Victorian culture goes. So Beatrix Potter never moved out of the nursery. Her parents kept her sheltered, kept her in the nursery well into her 30s. As an adult, she had to have a chaperone. If she went out in public, by her. She couldn't go unaccompanied. She had to have a chaperone because it wasn't proper for a young lady to be out and about in the city by herself. She needed a chaperone. Like, her chaperone, who was like a lifelong companion and became her ultimate best friend, was only a few years older than her, like 3 years older than her. And they were the ones, she was the one her parents hired to like be her chaperone. Well, she was in the nursery and under her parents' supervision up well into her 30s and even beyond, up into almost middle age. So she started keeping a journal in code when she was like middle school age, what we would consider, I don't know exactly how old she was, but she was like preteen. And she kept it for years and years and years. And so once it was decoded, it kind of gave a sort of insight into how her life was. Also, she was a very gifted artist, and she did things to make money for herself. Like, she illustrated Christmas cards, and she did little illustrations for like books and little posters and things, and her parents had no idea. She did this to like make money for herself. And when she first started publishing the Peter Rabbit stories, she did it, and her parents had no idea she even was doing all this, and she was doing it to slowly build up money to get away and get out on her own and to be able to buy her independence from her parents. It was just crazy. So she was also this sort of gifted scientist. Like, she is known, as much as she's known for the Peter Rabbit stuff, she's known for her contributions to like botany and biology and science in England. And so she did all of her own illustrations. She would observe nature. Like, her specialty was fungi, like mushrooms and funguses and things, and she would draw them in intricate, accurate detail. And so she even, because she was so detailed with her scientific illustrations and her naturalist art, she discovered, she made some scientific discoveries about the symbiotic relationship between certain fungi and the trees that they attach themselves to. And anyway, like, stuff that wasn't known about these species before. And her uncle, she wrote a paper about her findings, and her uncle had to present it for her at the Linnaean Society, which is the Society for Carl Linnaeus developed the classification system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, So the Linnaean Society is dedicated to the classification of the natural world, and women weren't allowed to attend meetings or present research. And so her uncle had to go and present her paper for her. And like, science textbooks of the day featured her illustrations. So I was let me get rid of me, and I was gonna show, see if I could show some of her scientific illustrations. They're gorgeous. Beatrix Potter. What should I put? I don't think science is. Oh yeah. Scientific illustrations. There we go. Hopefully my super slow internet will. Oh, here we go. So you can kind of see they are just absolutely gorgeous. Her illustrations of mushrooms and different fungi. And she did birds, and she did, other plant life and flowering species, and she did other little animals and insects and things too. But she was mainly known for plant life and specifically mushrooms and things. Just absolutely gorgeous illustrations. So she was very accomplished as a scientist. So I mentioned she had a companion, right, who was her chaperone. Well, this chaperone eventually had a life, got married, and had a bunch of kids, 8 kids. This chaperone had a bunch of kids. And so Beatrix Potter got very close to these kids because it was her best friend's kids, like you do. And so she started writing letters to them to entertain them. She would draw little pictures. And that's where the characters, the Peter Rabbit character and the little, the Tom Kitten character and all the little bunnies and stuff, they were from the letters she wrote to her friends' kids to entertain them. And so they would share them around, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, you should publish these. This would be great. This was, the turn of the century, early 1900s, whenever she started publishing these books. And the children's literature market was booming, especially these small format books like what she was wanting to do. So she submitted them to publishers, and several of them denied her, but then one did, Frederick and Warren Company, I think is what it's called, Frederick and Warren, anyway, it doesn't matter, but they decided to publish her books and her stories as little books for kids. And one of the things that is awesome about her publishing experience is that she was very hands-on and involved from day one. She was completely involved in the process. She was very particular about the size of the books and particular about the binding, and she was very particular about the colors. She mixed in all the colors herself and did, the illustrations. And she had this idea that she wanted them to be small enough for kids to hold and to put maybe in their pocket. And she had this vision of all of her little books lined up in a row on a child's bookshelf and how they would all look together. So she was very savvy about, sort of commercializing her stories and her product. Because she wasn't doing this from this romanticized place of, I want to inspire children or anything like that. She wanted money. She was trying to get her independence, and she's like, this is a good way to make money. And so I have some books here. So this is a collection I have of Beatrix Potter stories. This is a holiday collection, which basically means that the box is red and gold and has holly leaves on it. And the little covers are gold. But other than that, inside of them, they're normal. So let me get so the story you had to read was Jemima Puddle Duck. So if you take the gold slipcover off, you can pretty much kind of see that this is what, the books would have looked like, except, I'm trying to get it to focus. This is like hard. They were cloth. They would have been cloth, but they were little. This is about the size they would have been. And, it was, an illustration on one side, text on the other. And, it was very, particular how they were represented. So this is kind of like what they would have looked like. And you can kind of see how a little kid would just be so excited to have this little book all to themselves, and it's their size. And there were several of them in a whole series. And she was also very much involved in the merchandising process. We talked about Newbery and how you can get some merch for books. She made a board game, a Peter Rabbit board game that went along with the book. She designed a wallpaper, like kids' room, wallpaper and borders and decorations for the kids' room and everything. She designed all that. She was very much into the merchandising. And so she eventually was able to she earned bank on these books, and so she bought a farm in the Lake District, Hilltop Farm. And so, let me see if we can go back. Let me get rid of me. Hilltop Farm is where all of her stories were set after those first few. Hilltop, here we go. So she hired a family to be there and manage it, and so you can kind of see that you can kind of recognize this shot and this shot. You can kind of recognize that she would go out there and draw it, and a lot of the illustrations in her stories are from Hilltop Farm and some of the surrounding areas. So a little bit more about her. She ended up falling in love with and getting sort of secretly, unofficially engaged to one of the sons, one of the Warren brothers who worked for the publishing company, Norman Warren. Norman Warren. She fell in love with him, and they were going to be engaged. She was in her 30s at this point, and her parents were like, "No, we don't approve. He's in the working class. He's beneath us." And her parents wouldn't let them be engaged. And then tragically, not long after that, like maybe a month or two later, Norman died of anemia. So he died young, and they never got to get married or anything like that. So I think that was kind of a final straw with her, sort of to motivate her to kind of get out on her own. She never moved out of her parents' house until she was 47 years old, and she got married. So she ended up getting married to a lawyer, the lawyer who was helping her manage her country estates, like the farm. She ended up buying another farm across the street, and a neighboring farm. And this lawyer was helping her be smart about her real estate investment and her real estate purchases, and her managing her books and her copyrights and things. And they fell in love, and they ended up getting married when she was 47. They never had any kids, obviously, but they stayed married for 30 years until she died when she was 77. So she was a very late bloomer, but she ended up having a very happy life after she married this guy. And they moved out into the farm that's across the way that neighbors Hilltop Farm. And they ended up moving there. Then she got super into sheep breeding, and she became the first female president of I think it's the Hendrick is a kind of sheep, the Hendrick Sheep Breeding Association or Society or something like that. She was the president of the Sheep Breeding Association, and she got really into conservation. She moved away from being an author later in life, because for one, she didn't need to anymore because she had money. She had, she's changed over into being more of a scientist and conservationist. She didn't need the money, and so she kind of didn't really write any more stories. And she was also started losing her eyesight, so she couldn't illustrate as well. She couldn't get the detail, and she couldn't really see the colors, and so she just kind of abandoned it later in life, which is understandable. She just wasn't up to it anymore. But she ended up using the royalties and the rights because her stories were so popular. She ended up purchasing a bunch of land all around the Lake District. I want to say something like 14 farms, hundreds of acres. And so now, and when she died, in her will, she left almost all of that, except for just a little bit, to her family. But she left almost all of that, because she didn't have any kids, to a national trust that was set up to protect it. So now there's in England, there's the Lake District National Park, which is a government protected landmark, the Lake District Natural Park, and it's pretty much exists exactly as it was, unpolluted and undamaged and not interfered with, since she was purchasing it in the early 1900s. And so she's sort of credited with almost single-handedly conserving the Lake District and preserving it in perpetuity, so that it wasn't developed and wasn't sort of sold off and bowled over or whatever. You can still go there. It's still very rural. It's just a bunch of farmland, and it's protected. So not all of the Lake District National Park is Beatrix Potter's land, but most of it is. That's amazing to me. That is so cool to me. I just think that that's so great. And so I just admire her so much. I was going to show you, let me get rid of me. I was going to show you this is the handout for her. I just wanted to show you some of these are all her bunches of tales. She has several tales. And so all of these would have had their own little book in what I showed you. So you just read a couple of examples, but yeah, But you can kind of see she's had several. I'm going to turn the light on because it's getting dark on me. Okay, so I wanted to show you a couple more things. I know we're getting long, but I'll try to keep going. Okay, so I wanted to show you a few things about Beatrix Potter. I have a couple little stuffed animals. They're so cute. I got this one. I got Peter Rabbit in Cambridge. When I did my study abroad in England in grad school, I stayed a whole summer there and visited. And so I got this in Cambridge in a little bookstore. But he's got a little carrot and he's got little buttons. But we didn't read a Peter Rabbit story for this class. But I just assume most people have been exposed to Peter Rabbit. But I do have a little Jemima Puddle Duck. We did read about her, right, for the class. So I wanted to show you those. I also have my very beloved Complete Tales of Beatrix Potter. It's it comes out like that. And the readings that you had to read, I scanned in, were from this. So that's why they look like there was a couple on each page rather than, like the book I showed you where it's 101. Because, it's in a bigger format. I also have a few, like the Peter Rabbit, character is still a huge industry. There's still people, like I have these, they're, the actress Emma Thompson, who played Trelawney in the Harry Potter movies, if you know who that is, the divination teacher. She has written a couple of Peter Rabbit, stories, that are really cute. And I have a Christmas collection of Peter Rabbit stories. Most of these, as you can see, use that's like Beatrix Potter's original Peter Rabbit design. This is not. The Emma Thompson one, that is not. Now the one on the back kind of looks like it, but you can kind of tell when they're not using, like these are brand new stories, so they don't really have Beatrix Potter's, illustrated by Eleanor Taylor. Like you can, but it's still the same publisher, Frederick Warren, like still has the rights to her characters and can still publish them. But some of them, like this one it's a Lift the Flap book, but it has Beatrix Potter's illustrations in it. Some of them don't, though. Like this, this is a board book, Peter Rabbit's Lullaby, but these are not. I mean, they're kind of in the same style. They go for the same style, but it's not the same. It's altered quite a bit, but it's still pretty close. But I'm about to show you something that's going to haunt you. I found this at a consignment sale, and I had to buy it because it is the most buck wild thing I've ever seen, right? So, one of the things that is iconic about Beatrix Potter is her art, right? Her illustration. That's what she's known for. So, if you have the rights to her stories, there's absolutely no reason not to use her illustrations as well. But here's this. Someone has made the Peter Rabbit story with this situation. Beatrix Potter would probably be rolling over in her grave. I mean, I guess they're cute, but they are not. That's not Peter Rabbit. You can't just take a rabbit and put a blue coat on him and say he's Peter Rabbit. You just can't. I'm very passionate about this. I have, like I said, I have my little Peter Rabbit thing. I have a Christmas ornament that looks just like this as Peter Rabbit. And I admire Beatrix Potter so much. So this whole situation of these rabbits, like it's all the scenes from the story, but it's drawn in this crazy cartoony way. I don't know. It's haunted to me. And then I'll show you this thing. This was mine when I was a kid. It's not all of the stories, but it is, many of, like it's the Peter Rabbit ones. And so I just wanted to show you in the front. There's the front thing. That's my maiden name, White. Sarah Elizabeth White. Love to you from Daddy and Mommy, March 24th, 1985. So I was born in 81. So I was 3. This was before I turned 4 in 1985. So this was a little gift for like preschool or whatever that I got this. And it was a beloved book that I read many, many times growing up throughout my childhood. So I just wanted to show, I still have it from back in the 80s when I got it. So I want to talk about, Jemima Puddle Duck a little bit. And you had to read the scary Tom Kitten story where he's rolled up, which gave me nightmares as a kid, where he's rolled up in the dough and then the rats are going to eat him. And, I was going to, I just had you read that because it always gave me nightmares as a kid. And I had you read the Jemima Puddle Duck because to me, in my mind, those two stories go together. They have almost the same theme, which is being naive about how the world works and sort of fighting against civilized society and your more sort of basic animalistic nature. I don't want to pick these stories apart. I mean, hopefully maybe we can leave that up to your reading responses to sort of let me know how you thought about the stories themselves. But I will point out one of the things that Beatrix Potter is known for is her use of clothing on the animals and how she sort of strategically uses the clothing that the animals wear, and sometimes they don't wear. Like if you'll look at, when you look at the scans in the story of Jemima Puddle Duck, when she is in danger, or when she's like sitting on her eggs or doing something very animalistic, she's not wearing her clothes. But when she's trying to be out and about and in society, and she meets the fox, who's only described as a very nice gentleman, he's not ever described as a fox in the text. She's wearing her clothes, so it's almost like this, trying to live in two different worlds. Tom Kitten is the same way. He's wearing little clothes, but then when he gets up to mischief and he goes off on his own, and he gets caught, he's stripped of his clothes, he's stripped of his the identifying elements of civilization, and it's more animalistic. So a lot of people have sort of noticed and written about the way that Beatrix Potter uses clothes as sort of a representation of the confines of society. As I said, she was very sheltered. Her life was very managed in a very strict way. So some people think she's using the clothes to represent the sort of stifling nature of society. Peter Rabbit, the story which you didn't read, his clothing is what almost gets him killed. He's wearing his blue jacket with the gold buttons, and it gets caught on the fence and rips, and he almost gets caught by Farmer McGregor, or whatever his name is. Farmer Gregor, maybe. And his clothing and almost is his downfall. And then when he sheds it and runs off fully just as a rabbit is whenever he's able to be safe. So pay attention. If you haven't already, pay attention to her use of clothes in the illustrations in her stories. I think that's all I want to say about Beatrix Potter. I want to say a little bit about A.A. Milne. I know this video is getting very long, so if you want to, take breaks or whatever, you can. But I want to talk about A.A. Milne because he's such an interesting character as well. So I'll pull up a picture of him. So that's A.A. Milne and Christopher Robin. Let me put me over here on the side. So that's a colorized picture. It's originally black and white. There's been some movies made recently about the relationship between A.A. Milne and his son Christopher Robin. And they had a really problematic relationship growing up. A.A. Milne was a playwright. He wrote plays for adults. He also adapted plays for kids. Like he made a play, Toad in Toad's Hall, I think is what it's called. And it's an adaptation of Wind in the Willows, one of the stories from Wind in the Willows. And it was a very successful play. And so he was already a writer, but he started writing poetry about growing up, and he famously used his son and his son's toys. Let me search up here. Oh, yeah. Winnie the Pooh toys. Original. Yeah, that should do it. So, that's working on that. So his son, Christopher Robin, here they are. These toys still exist. They are on display in the New York Public Library. You can kind of see, I'll move me. You can kind of see there. That's what the display looks like. Here's a photo shoot that they were doing. But, Winnie the Pooh, his name is actually Edward Bear. That's what the toy was named, Edward Bear. And in some of the poetry that Milne wrote, I have a collection here, was named Edward Bear. And then there was a circus bear that they saw at a zoo, and it was named Winnie, I think. And so anyway, the name and the likeness came from a couple different places. So that's what the toys look like, and if you go to the New York Public Library, you can see them. He published a collection. I have this Complete Tales of Winnie the Pooh here, and he has a few different books. So he has, let me tell you what they are. The first one is called Winnie the Pooh. And then the other one is The House at Pooh Corner. And then there's two collections of poetry. When We Were Very Young. And the last one is Now We Are Six. And that is the poetry. And so the poetry features Christopher Robin and Edward Bear and some of the same. And it's all very nostalgic and almost like this melancholy look at the loss of childhood and this sort of innocent time. I've mentioned this in class a couple times. I've mentioned this in other videos. When we read Peter Pan, we'll talk about this some more. But whereas Wind in the Willows and Beatrix Potter's stories are sort of playful and a little bit more upbeat, Winnie the Pooh is typically a lot more melancholic. It's sort of sad. I mean, I don't know if children see it as sad, but it's adults definitely pick up on a sadness that's in Winnie the Pooh. The kind of the sketchy thing, I guess, let me blow myself back up here, is that after the first publications about Winnie the Pooh came out, Christopher Robin Milne, the real person, became super duper famous, like super famous. He was one of the most famous children in the world. Like, there was an article in a magazine at the time, and it was like top 10 most famous children, and he was like third or something on the list, under like the Prince or something, like, monarch's children. And then Christopher Robin was like third or fourth on the list. So he became super duper famous, well known, because the character based on him was so beloved. Well, when he was little, he kind of was into it because he got all this attention, and he did interviews, and like reporters wanted to talk to him, and he had all these stories that had his toys in them. But the older he got, he really resented the attention. He really resented his dad for sort of exploiting his life and his childhood that way. They became estranged. They didn't talk for decades. A.A. Milne went to his deathbed, never speaking to his dad again after, a certain point when he got into adulthood. And I mean, his mom was, he didn't, he was estranged from his family because he rejected, the fame that came from Winnie the Pooh. He refused to take any inheritance or money from the Winnie the Pooh estate. He became a bookseller and book publisher. He worked in publishing, but he and his wife, he married his first cousin. Christopher Robin did. He married his first cousin, and they set up a book selling, like a bookshop and book publishing thing, all on their own money and work, and didn't use any of his family's money from Winnie the Pooh. So it's kind of a tragic story. I didn't mention this either, but Alistair Graham, Kenneth Graham's son, had a tragic end. He ended up throwing himself on a railroad track when he was 19 and committing suicide. When we get to Peter Pan, there's similar fate to the Llewellyn Davies boys that they resented it. Alice Little with Alice in Wonderland, who Alice from Alice in Wonderland, the real person, she resented her being sort of characterized in that way and had a big falling out with J.M. Barrie, and there's some suggestions of bad, we'll talk about that in class, bad, inappropriate stuff. So this is not unusual. It's still very sad, though, that they had that relationship or lack of relationship. But a lot of people see this sort of adult lens looking back on childhood, but the poetry is sort of very soft, and it's playful, but in like a thoughtful way. It's like it's very thoughtful about childhood and about the experiences of childhood, and clinging to your nurse's skirts and hearing the swish, and just very sensory. The poetry is about childhood. So if you like that, if you like the idea of like this sort of innocent time of childhood, reading A.A. Milne's poetry is like a really good idea for you. So when A.A. Milne died, Christopher Robin didn't want anything to do with Winnie the Pooh. So Milne, this family, I forget their names, but they bought the rights to it. They were able to buy up the rights to all of the characters. And then the next generation after that, like their kids sold the rights to the Winnie the Pooh characters to Disney in the 1960s. So in the 1960s is when we started seeing the very well recognized Winnie the Pooh cartoons that everybody knows, with his little red shirt and the honey, and he talks like that. That was my Winnie the Pooh. You're welcome. Those Disney versions started coming out in the 1960s when Disney bought the rights for a lot of money, like $350 million or something like that. They bought the rights to the whole Winnie the Pooh franchise, and so now Winnie the Pooh is a Disney property, which it didn't start that way, but they bought the Winnie the Pooh stories were coming out in like the 20s, and then by the 60s Disney owned it. So I want to mention something about Ernest Shepard. Ernest Shepard is the illustrator who illustrated the Winnie the Pooh stories. You can kind of get an example. His Ernest Shepard's illustrations are pretty much as credited with being a huge factor of the success of the stories, because his illustrations are so iconic. And Ernest Shepard, ironically, is also the person who illustrated Wind in the Willows, and he's not the first person to illustrate Wind in the Willows, but Ernest Shepard's illustrations are now synonymous with Wind in the Willows, even though other people have illustrated it and he wasn't the first person to illustrate it. Ernest Shepard's illustrations of Wind in the Willows are the classic ones. But his illustrations of Winnie the Pooh are classic. But Disney changed some things. For one, notice what Winnie the Pooh is not wearing. There is no little red shirt. You see? He has no little red shirt. He's just a bear. Christopher Robin looks pretty much the same in his illustrations. Here's the book I have that's the story you had in your Norton, the Expotition. Here's a little book form of it, and Christopher Robin looks pretty much the same from the cartoon, but Pooh does not have a shirt on. The little red shirt is pretty much a Disney thing. There's like one or two stories in here where they go out in the snow and he has a little coat, and it's red and it's got sleeves, and it has like one button that buttons right here, but it's open. So it's like a little red coat that he wears in a couple of the stories. So maybe they were taking that, but it became his standard shirt, the red t-shirt. Something else you'll notice is Piglet. It's backwards. Piglet is green. So in the original Ernest Shepard illustrations, Piglet isn't pink, or in the cartoon he's pink with like a purple middle, I guess you could say. But in these, and his little, you can't see it, but his little shirt, it has buttons. It's green stripe and has little black buttons. So he wears like a green outfit in the original illustrations. It's kind of interesting. Eeyore, however, looks exactly the same. You can kind of see Eeyore right over here. Yeah. And Rabbit, Kanga and Rabbit, all them look the same. Rabbit and Owl were invented characters. They were not toys. But Tigger and Pooh and Piglet and Kanga and Roo, those were all toys that Christopher Robin had. Roo was lost in the woods, so we don't have Roo anymore. Roo was lost in some wood somewhere, but we have Kanga. We have all the other ones in the library that I showed you. So let's see. I wanted to end. There's a couple things that Winnie the Pooh is sort of admired for, or things that people talk about with Winnie the Pooh. One of them is that people think that the characters in Winnie the Pooh represent parts of your mind, kind of Inside Out style, where Eeyore is sadness, and Tigger is joy, and Rabbit is anger because he's always cranky, and I don't know if there's a disgust. Maybe Piglet is his fear. Fear is Piglet. The Owl might be disgust because he's very smart and everything is just like, really? to him. So like you kind of can take all of the characters and they match up with the Inside Out personality to characters. So people have kind of looked at that. Some people like to look at the characters in Winnie the Pooh as representations of mental disorders. So, Eeyore is depression. Piglet is anxiety. Tigger is hyperactive or ADHD. So I mean, there's all these. I don't know how you would one-to-one match them up. I don't know what Rabbit would be. He has anger issues. He's maybe a sociopath or something. But so you have all these people who like to theorize that. But if you look at Eeyore as having depression, you might have seen there's a meme going around. I've seen it a few times. Several people have shared it with me, where somebody has sort of had a very thoughtful reading of Eeyore, where Eeyore is pretty much always sad, doesn't always want to participate. He can't really hang for very long because he has to go back and have alone time. And the thing that it's praised for is that all of his friends understand that about him. They understand, Eeyore's done for the day, or Eeyore wants to be by himself, let's not bother him, or we haven't heard from Eeyore in a while, let's go check on him, right, and make sure he's okay. And so, Winnie the Pooh, the characters have been praised for a positive depiction of how to be friends with someone with a mental illness, or with depression, or with anxiety like Piglet has. He's afraid of everything and nervous and unsure. So Winnie the Pooh as a franchise has been praised for dealing with issues like that in a positive way. Probably the most famous and heartbreaking scene, and we'll end with this, and y'all are like, finally, we will end with this scene. It's the very last scene of the second, the House at Pooh Corner, and it's when Christopher Robin is finding out he's going off to school. So when a young British boy goes off to school, a la Harry Potter style, it's when they're leaving childhood behind and they're going off into like the next phase of their lives, right? They're having to start growing up. And so Christopher Robin comes to visit the 100-Acre Wood, which is like his imagination place. He comes to visit the 100-Acre Wood to say goodbye to Winnie the Pooh for the last time and to tell him that he can't come back. And so I thought I would just read this last little bit to us. So here's the picture where they're in the 100-Acre Wood, and Christopher Robin and Pooh are hanging out together. And then here's a picture with him being thoughtful. And so I guess I'll just start here. Let's see. But Pooh was thinking too, and he said suddenly to Christopher Robin, "Is it a very grand thing to be an afternoon, what you said?" "A what?" said Christopher Robin lazily as he listened to something else. "On a horse," explained Pooh. "Oh, a knight!" He thought he said afternoon, but he forgot. It was a knight. Oh, was that it?" said Pooh. "I thought it was a... Is it as grand as a king and factors and all the other things you said?" Because Christopher Robin told him he was going to leave to go learn factors and about being like a king, kings and factors. "Well, it's not as grand as a king," said Christopher Robin. And then, as Pooh seemed disappointed, he added quickly, "But it's grander than factors." "Could a bear be one?" "Of course he could," said Christopher Robin. "I'll make you one." And he took a stick and touched Pooh on the shoulder and said, "Rise, Sir Pooh de Bear, most faithful of all my knights." And there's a picture of him knighting him with a stick. So Pooh rose and sat down and said, "Thank you," which is the proper thing to say when you have been made a knight. And he went into a dream again, in which he and Sir Pomp and Sir Brazil and Factors lived together with a horse, and were faithful knights, all except Factors, who looked after the horse, to good King Christopher Robin. And every now and then he shook his head and said to himself, "I'm not getting it right." Then he began to think of all the things Christopher Robin would want to tell him when he came back from wherever he was going to, and how muddling it would be for a bear of very little brain to try and get them right in his mind. "So perhaps," he said sadly to himself, "Christopher Robin won't tell me any more." And he wondered if being a faithful knight meant that you just went on being faithful without being told things. Then suddenly again Christopher Robin, who was still looking at the world with his chin in his hands, called out, "Pooh!" "Yes," said Pooh. When Pooh!" "Yes, Christopher Robin." "I'm not going to do nothing any more." "Never again?" "Well, not so much. They don't let you." And there's a picture here of him. Pooh waited for him to go on, but he was silent again. "Yes, Christopher Robin?" Pooh said helpfully. "Pooh, when I'm not doing nothing," meaning at school, "will you come up here sometimes?" The woods. "Just me?" "Yes, Pooh." "Will you be here too?" "Yes, Pooh, I will be. Really, I promise I will be, Pooh." "That's good," said Pooh. "Pooh, promise you won't forget about me, ever. Not even when I'm 100. Pooh thought for a little. "How old shall I be then?" 99. Pooh nodded. "I promise," he said. Still with his eyes on the world, Christopher Robin put out a hand and felt for Pooh's paw. "Pooh," said Christopher Robin earnestly, If I'm not quite..." He stopped and tried again. "Pooh, whatever happens, you will understand, won't you?" "Understand what?" Oh, nothing." He laughed and jumped to his feet. "Come on." "Where?" said Pooh. "Anywhere," said Christopher Robin. And this is the last lines of Winnie the Pooh. So they went off together. But wherever they go, and whatever happens to them on the way, in that enchanted place on the top of the forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing. And that's the final picture. It just makes me get so emotional every time I read it. And then when I think about Milne and his estranged relationship with Christopher Robin, and sort of this whole, how it represents this whole sort of melancholy loss of childhood that the adults in this era were feeling, and we're trying to capture it. Him, J.M. Barrie, and Kenneth Grahame, and like all of these, different people who are just trying to grasp, and Charles Dodson even with Alice in Wonderland. And this, reading this makes me get kind of emotional, but it's like a nice little punctuation mark on how, this sort of era felt about childhood, and how they use the animals, the animal characters to sort of express things that maybe a human couldn't express. Okay, so I'm finally done talking. It's been a long video. So, you know, if you need to, like I said, if you needed to take breaks, that's fine. Thank you for sticking with me. Normally, when I teach this class, not online, it's 2 classes. Kenneth Graham, Winnie the Willows is a whole class, and then Beatrix Potter and Winnie the Pooh are a whole class. But since we couldn't do that this time, I've combined them together. So I appreciate you hanging in there with me, and write in your reading responses about what you thought about the stories that you read, and if you had any questions about them, I'll try to respond as best I can. Otherwise, have a great week, and I will talk to you guys later.